name's Kainde Manji. I am doing a PhD in urban studies at the University of Glasgow, and I'm looking at the impact of welfare reforms on disabled people living in Scotland. Absolutely. So I'm looking, obviously, since 2010, the UK government introduced a number of changes to the way that particularly disability benefits have been administered in the UK. And I'm looking at specifically the impact that that's having on disabled people living in Scotland. So really looking at their lived experience of going through this process of reform, how that's affecting them on a day-to-day basis, kind of looking beyond the kind of obvious financial impacts to what it means to live under such a fast-changing policy environment. I mean, I think there's a lot of important messages. I think this is a really important time to be doing this research, and it's become more critical as the PhD has progressed. UK benefits, the benefit system is reserved to Westminster, but since the referendum, recommendations through the Smith Commission have proposed devolving some of the disability benefits to the Scottish Parliament. So I think that makes it even more important to understand how people in Scotland are being affected. I suppose the real message is about focusing on the lived experience in policy development and making sure that people who are likely to be affected by policy are involved and engaged in the policy making from the very, very start. It's the principle of co-production, and that's something that should be running through all of policy. And I think looking forward to how benefits may be devolved to Scotland, I think that would be a really important and interesting principle for Scotland to take account of. I haven't found a huge amount of difference in terms of my own research from research that's looked at a whole UK perspective, or looking at specifically England or Wales or Northern Ireland. But I do think it's worth looking at the Scottish perspective from the point of view that there are some things that are different in terms of devolution. We have a different labour market structure with benefits looking to be devolved in the future. I think that makes it more important to have that Scottish perspective. For example, the impact of changes to local government funding and the introduction of self-directed support has been a difference in Scotland as compared to the rest of the UK. And so when looking at that cumulative effect, the cumulative effect is slightly different, even though a lot of the times it's some of the same policies that are being taken into account. I am cautiously optimistic about the devolution of certain disability benefits. I think a lot of it will be the proof will be in the eating and how that is developed. I don't think it's going to be a cure-all to some of the problems I think some people have assumed, and I'm not convinced that Scottish-only solutions will necessarily make things completely different. I think there needs to be quite a profound policy overhaul in order for that to take place, and it's not clear yet whether that is likely to happen. But I think having that principle of co-production embedded early on, if policymakers take account of that, could lead to some quite positive, different policy implications. But I think devolving policy in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be better or different. I think that is a very significant issue. I think a lot of the reforms that we've seen have been pushed by a very particular ideological agenda. I think you can see that in the way that reforms are framed. There's some very interesting work around the idea of independence in terms of independent living. The movement, the disability movement, has talked about independent living for a number of years as a kind of policy goal. But we're seeing that language being co-opted and kind of used against the movement in a lot of ways in the new benefits. So, for example, the disability living allowance is becoming the personal independence payment. Jenny Morris has argued that that is essentially a neoliberal individualising agenda that's co-opting the language of the disabled people's movement. Actually, from what I've seen, a lot of those policy aims in terms of independence are unlikely to be realised because disabled people aren't being involved in the development of the policy process. The 2015 general election is obviously very important because it will determine who the next government will be. A lot of the reforms that were begun in 2010 haven't yet come into effect. So, for example, the personal independence payment was supposed to have been rolled out more or less by now, but the timeframes have been pushed back several times. Depends whether things have gone too far for it to be financially viable for a new government to roll that back. And I think a lot of that still remains to be seen. If the current government are re-elected, or if there is a majority Conservative government elected, we can see probably a deepening and a harshening of some of the reforms that have already taken place, and a slightly different trajectory in terms of social policy in this country. Something that I find very interesting was there's been a lot of talk and discussion and awareness about increasing conditionality within the benefit system. And that's something that's been quite a formalised process. For example, job seekers allowance, there is increasing use of sanctions, and people are expected to behave in particular ways in order to receive their benefits. What I found, which I found very interesting and which I wasn't expecting, was the extent to which that's been informalised. They feel that they have to perform and demonstrate particular things, particular attributes, particular attitudes when they're going for assessments for disability benefits. Kind of subtle conditionality monitoring in their day-to-day lives. This sense that people are being watched, that there is the rise of the scrounger rhetoric is having is causing people to internalise those views and those feelings. Some of my participants felt that they were afraid to go out and engage in everyday activities and be part of society, because that would be seen somehow as evidence of them being capable to work. And what was particularly worrying about that was the extent to which that was setting people back in terms of their impairment, making those impairment effects more substantial. One of my participants had mental health problems, and he was terrified to leave the house in case his benefits were taken away from him. And that was something that, the subtlety of that was something that surprised me.